A deadly snowstorm had turned the mountains into a frozen grave. John was lost, freezing, and certain he would never make it out alive. Then, through the blinding snow, he saw something lying motionless on the ground. A young Apache woman, barely alive. He had only two choices: leave her behind and save himself, or give her his coat, risk his own life, and carry her through the storm. John chose to save her. But he had no idea that this one decision would lead him straight into a deadly ambush, and eventually force an Apache chief to give him the most shocking choice of his life: a fortune in gold, or his daughter's hand in marriage. But John's answer left the entire tribe speechless. Watch Love in the Wild West on the next video app as soon as possible. Please subscribe to my channel. Here is the English translation of the script, adapted for natural flow and narrative impact while preserving the original tone and details. The wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves tearing through the mountains. The snow fell with such fury that John could barely distinguish his own horse's ears. Every breath burned his lungs as if he were swallowing frozen fire, and his hands, though protected by thick, worn leather gloves, had lost all sensation over an hour ago. "Hold on, Thunder," he murmured to the horse, patting its frost-soaked neck. "Just a little further, boy." But deep down, John knew he was lying. He had no idea where he was. The mountain pass he had crossed so many times over the last few years had transformed into a relentless white labyrinth, a deadly trap where every direction looked exactly like the last. He had been riding alone through these vast western territories for 3 long years. 3 years since he left everything behind without looking back. 3 years searching for something he couldn't even name. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt that perhaps his journey would end here, buried under an endless blanket of snow, in the middle of nowhere, with no one ever knowing what became of him. 10 Note: if you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you are listening from. Your support means everything to us and motivates us to keep bringing you these stories. Thunder neighed nervously and stopped abruptly, planting his hooves firmly in the snow. "What is it, boy? What do you see?" John squinted until his eyes were mere slits, desperately trying to penetrate the white curtain enveloping him. At first he distinguished absolutely nothing, only snow and more snow falling mercilessly. But then a dark shape began to materialize among the flakes dancing in the wind. His heart gave a violent lurch in his chest. It was a person lying in the middle of the storm. Without thinking for a second, John dismounted in one leap and ran toward the motionless figure. His boots sank into the snow up to his knees, making every step difficult. But that didn't stop him. When he finally arrived, he fell to his knees beside the frost-covered body. It was a young woman. Her face, though terribly pale from the relentless cold, showed unmistakable features that John recognized immediately. Skin bronzed like the desert earth, high and elegant cheekbones, and hair black as a raven's wing spreading over the white snow, creating a striking contrast. She wore traditional Apache clothing, beautifully decorated with bright-colored beads that were now completely covered in frost and ice. "Miss?" John shook her gently by the shoulders. "Miss, wake up, please. Open your eyes." Nothing, not the slightest movement, not a single sound escaped her blue-tinged lips. With hands trembling from cold and worry, John pressed his ear to the unknown woman's lips. For a terrible moment that seemed to last an eternity, he heard absolutely nothing. The silence was deafening. But then, faint as the flutter of a butterfly in spring, he felt a small puff of warm breath against his cheek. She was alive, barely hanging by an invisible thread, but still alive. John didn't waste another second. He ripped off his thick fur coat, the same one that had protected him through 3 cruel winters, and carefully wrapped the woman in it. Then he lifted her into his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She was light, too light for her own good, and her fragile body trembled with violent spasms she couldn't control. "Thunder, this lady needs our help urgently," said John as he carefully placed the woman on the saddle. He mounted behind her, holding her firmly against his chest to transfer whatever heat his body could offer. He had to find shelter, and he had to do it right now before it was too late. As if fate finally decided to show some mercy after hours of torment, John spotted a rectangular shape emerging from the incessant snowfall. An old cabin, clearly abandoned long ago, with parts of the roof caved in. But it was shelter, it was hope. They arrived in what felt like a frozen eternity. John dismounted with the woman still in his arms and kicked the door with all his strength. The rotten wood gave way easily, opening with a mournful creak. The interior was pitch black and covered in thick dust, but the solid walls stopped the murderous wind, and that was absolutely all that mattered. At that moment, John gently deposited the woman onto an old wooden bed that creaked under her weight and began to work frantically against time. He found a blackened stone fireplace in the corner and, thank heavens, a considerable pile of dry firewood stacked in a dark corner. His hands trembled violently as he tried to light the fire, but years of experience surviving alone in wild territories did their job. Soon, the flames began to crackle with growing strength, filling the abandoned cabin with golden light and blessed warmth. John returned immediately to the mysterious woman. Her face was still as pale as the winter full moon, but he noticed with relief that the shivering had decreased slightly. He took her icy hands in his and began to rub them gently, trying to restore life and warmth. "Come on, miss," he whispered with a hoarse voice. "Don't leave me now. Don't give up after I found you." The hours passed with desperate slowness. John fed the fire all night without rest, not allowing the flames to die for a single instant. His tired eyes constantly watched the woman's face, looking for any sign of improvement, any indication that she would survive. And then, when the first golden rays of dawn began to timidly filter through the cracks of the old cabin, the miracle finally happened. The woman's eyelids trembled softly. John held his breath, daring not to move. Slowly, very slowly, she opened her eyes. They were the color of dark honey under the summer sun, deep and bright like stars on a clear night. For an eternal moment, they just stared at the cracked wooden ceiling, uncomprehending. Then they turned toward John. Fear shone in them immediately, intense and wild. The woman tried to sit up abruptly, but her severely weakened body simply didn't obey her commands. She fell back onto the bed with a groan, breathing heavily. "Calm, calm," said John softly, raising both hands to show he posed no threat. "You are completely safe here. I found you nearly frozen in the snow. I only want to help you. I promise." She studied him with deep distrust, her penetrating eyes scanning every detail of his sun-weathered face, looking for any sign of deception or bad intentions. Who are you?" she asked finally. Her voice was barely a hoarse, weak whisper. "My name is John, miss. And what is your name?" A long pause filled with tension. Then, almost with visible reluctance, "Yepa. My name is Yepa." Yepa felt as if her entire body were made of heavy stone. Every muscle, every bone, every fiber of her being protested with a dull pain that seemed endless. She tried to move again, but her limbs refused to obey her, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The man in front of her, this stranger named John, remained motionless at a respectful distance. His hands were still raised in a sign of peace, and his sky-blue eyes watched her with a mixture of genuine concern and relief that she hadn't expected to find on a stranger's face. Where am I?" asked Yepa. Her voice was still weak and raspy like sandpaper. "In an old abandoned miner's cabin," John replied calmly. "I found you lying in the snow during the storm. You were nearly frozen, miss. A few more minutes out there, and—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the meaning was perfectly clear. Yepa closed her eyes for a moment, trying to order the scattered fragments of her memory. She remembered leaving her village at dawn. She remembered the threatening gray sky and her father's warnings, which she had stubbornly ignored. She remembered the snow starting to fall, first softly, then with unstoppable fury. She remembered her horse stumbling, the impact against the frozen ground, and then nothing, only cold, silent darkness. My horse, she said suddenly, opening her eyes in alarm. Where is my horse? John's expression darkened slightly as he shook his head. I'm very sorry. When I found you, you were completely alone. There was no horse nearby. The storm probably scared it, and it fled. A knot of anguish formed in Yeppa's throat. That horse had been a gift from her mother before she passed into the spirit world. Losing it was like losing the last physical tie to her sacred memory. John seemed to notice her pain because his voice softened even more when he spoke again. Maybe when the storm passes, we can look for it. Horses are intelligent and resilient animals. Perhaps it found refuge in a nearby cave. Yeppa didn't answer. Instead, she studied the man more closely now that the initial panic was beginning to fade. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the physique of someone accustomed to hard work under the relentless sun. His face was weathered by years of wind and climate, with a few days' beard darkening his strong jaw. But it was his eyes that intrigued her most. There was something in them, a shadow of ancient sadness that she recognized immediately because she carried it in her own heart. Why did you help me? She asked finally, distrust still present in her voice. Your people and mine are not exactly friends. John shrugged with disarming simplicity. A person was in danger. That was all I saw. I didn't see an Apache or an enemy or anything like that. I saw someone who needed urgent help, and I could give it. It's that simple, miss. Yeppa frowned, clearly not entirely convinced. She had learned from a very young age to distrust pretty words, especially when they came from strangers appearing out of nowhere. Her father, the great chief of her tribe, had always taught her that actions spoke much louder than any elaborate speech. I have to return to my village, said Yeppa, attempting to get up once more with iron determination. This time she managed to sit on the bed, although the effort left her dizzy and breathless. My people need me. I was carrying important medicines for the sick elders. With all due respect, miss, you are going nowhere at this moment, said John firmly, but without aggression. Look outside. The storm is still raging with all its fury. Going out now would be certain suicide. And those medicines you mentioned won't serve anyone if you freeze to death trying to deliver them. Yeppa wanted to protest. She wanted to scream that he had no right to tell her what to do. But deep down, she knew perfectly well the man was right. She could hear the wind howling outside like a hungry beast, shaking the cabin walls with violence. Trying to leave now was absolute madness. Fine, she conceded finally with evident reluctance. I will wait, but as soon as the storm calms, I leave immediately. Of course, John nodded. And if you'll allow me, I will accompany you to your village to ensure you arrive safely. These territories can be dangerous for someone traveling alone. I can take care of myself perfectly, replied Yeppa with wounded pride. I have traveled these mountains since I was a little girl. I don't doubt it for a second, miss. But even the best warriors need help from time to time. There is no shame in accepting it. The following hours passed in a silence that gradually became less uncomfortable. John prepared a hot broth with provisions he carried in his saddlebags. And although Yeppa initially refused to accept it out of pure pride, the delicious aroma and the roar of her empty stomach eventually convinced her. While they ate by the crackling fire, they began to talk. At first, they were brief and cautious comments, simple observations about the weather and the endless storm. But little by little, the words began to flow more naturally, like a river finding its course after the spring thaw. John told her about his solitary travels through the territory, about the incredible landscapes he had witnessed and the interesting people he had met along the way. He spoke of sunsets that set the sky ablaze over deep canyons and of herds of wild horses running free across infinite prairies. Yeppa, despite herself, found herself listening with genuine interest. This man was not like the others she had known before. He didn't look at her with contempt or arrogant superiority. He treated her simply as an equal, as another human being worthy of absolute respect. "And you?" asked John, as the fire projected dancing shadows on the walls. "What were you doing so far from your village in the middle of such a dangerous storm?" Yapa sighed deeply before answering honestly. Several elders of my tribe are seriously ill. The healer needed special herbs that only grow on the other side of the mountain. I volunteered to go get them because I know the path better than anyone. Your father must be very worried about you right now. Yapa nodded. Sadness reflected in her honey-colored eyes. My father is the chief of our tribe. He is a strong and wise man, but since my mother died 3 winters ago, he has become very protective of me. He is probably gathering warriors right now to come look for me. Something changed in John's face upon hearing this. A flash of genuine respect lit up his tired eyes. Then we have another important reason to take you back, safe and sound, as soon as possible, Miss Yapa. We don't want your father to lose valuable warriors searching for you in this storm. For the first time since waking up, Yapa felt that maybe, just maybe, she could trust this lonely stranger that fate had placed in her path. Outside, the storm continued its furious and relentless dance. But inside the small cabin, something new and delicate began to be born silently between 2 solitary souls that destiny had decided to unite on the coldest night of winter. The storm finally gave up on the 3rd day, leaving behind a world transformed into shimmering white mantle. The sun appeared timidly among the gray clouds, making the snow sparkle like millions of small diamonds scattered across the mountains. It was a landscape of breathtaking beauty, but John knew they couldn't stay to admire it for long. How do you feel today, Miss Yapa? He asked, while saddling Thunder with practiced and efficient movements. Yapa stood by the cabin door, stretching her muscles which had finally regained their strength. After 3 days of forced rest, color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes shone with renewed determination and energy. Much better, thank you. Ready to go home once and for all. John nodded and offered his hand to help her mount. Yapa hesitated for a brief instant, her pride fighting against the practicality of the situation, but finally accepted the help without saying a word. She settled into the saddle while John mounted behind her, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to hold her if necessary. My people's village is to the east, following the frozen river until you reach the valley between the twin mountains, indicated Yapa, pointing in the direction with her hand. I know that valley well, replied John. We can arrive before nightfall if we keep a steady pace. They rode in silence for the first few hours, crossing landscapes that seemed taken from a winter dream. Snow-covered pines rose like silent sentinels on both sides of the winding path, and the only sound breaking the quiet was the rhythmic crunch of Thunder's hooves on the compacted snow. Yapa found herself gradually relaxing against John's chest, absorbing the comforting heat of his body. There was something strangely familiar and secure in his presence, something she couldn't explain with words, but felt deeply in the depths of her heart. They were crossing a narrow canyon with rocky walls when Thunder stopped abruptly, neighing with palpable nervousness. His ears moved in all directions, catching sounds that human ears could not yet perceive. Something is very wrong, murmured John, his body tensing like a bowstring. His hand moved instinctively toward the revolver hanging from his worn belt. Then he saw them. 4 riders emerged from behind huge rocks, blocking the path ahead. 2 others appeared from behind, cutting off any easy possibility of retreat. All wore dark bandanas covering the lower half of their faces and dusty hats pulled down to their eyebrows. Well, said the one who seemed to be the leader, a burly man mounted on a horse as black as night. What do we have here? A lone traveler with a very interesting companion. John kept his expression completely neutral, quickly assessing the situation with expert eyes. 6 armed men, unfavorable terrain for a quick escape. Yapa unarmed and still recovering from her terrible experience. The odds didn't look promising, but he had faced worse situations in his years of solitary wandering. We don't want any trouble, gentlemen, said John with a calm and firm voice. We are just travelers passing through, seeking to reach our destination. The leader let out a harsh laugh that resonated between the walls of the narrow canyon. Do you know who we are, friend? We are the Dust Devils, and this canyon is our exclusive territory. Everyone who passes through here has to pay a toll or face the consequences." "Wait a minute, boss," interrupted another bandit, approaching to look closer at Yepa with narrowed eyes. "I know this woman. She is the Apache Chief's daughter, the princess of the Valley tribe. She's worth a fortune in ransom." The leader's eyes lit up with greed upon hearing these words. Well, it seems today is our extraordinary lucky day. Hand over the woman, Cowboy, and maybe we'll let you go in one piece." John felt Yepa tense against him, but his voice didn't tremble a bit when he responded with unshakable firmness. "That is not going to happen. Excuse me, don't you know how to count, friend? We are 6 armed men against 1 alone. You have exactly 0 chance of winning. Then I guess you'll have to come get her yourselves." What happened next occurred so fast that Yepa could barely follow it with her eyes. John spurred Thunder forward while simultaneously shouting with all the strength of his lungs. The sudden noise and abrupt movement frightened the bandits' horses, which began to rear and spin in chaotic circles. Amidst the absolute confusion, John drew his revolver with lightning speed. 3 precise shots rang out in the canyon, but he didn't aim at the men, but at their hands. The first shot tore the weapon from the leader's hand. The second did the same with the nearest bandit. The third shattered the rifle of a third man before he could even aim. "My hand! My hand!" screamed the leader, shaking it frantically, although he hadn't been hurt, only disarmed by the force of the impact against his weapon. John didn't waste a second. He pulled a small firecracker from his saddlebag, which he always carried for emergencies, lit it, and threw it toward the legs of the enemy horses. The small explosion and resulting smoke caused total panic among the animals, which shot off in all directions, dragging their terrified riders with them. "Let's get out of here," shouted the leader of the Dust Devils, struggling to control his runaway horse. "This guy is completely crazy." In a matter of seconds, the 6 bandits had disappeared down the canyon, the sound of their galloping horses quickly fading into the distance. John remained motionless for a long moment, his revolver still raised, ensuring they had truly left for good. "Are you okay, Miss Yepa?" he asked finally, holstering his weapon. Yepa was trembling slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was pure adrenaline running through her veins like liquid fire. Never in her life had she seen someone move with such amazing speed and precision. This man had faced 6 armed bandits alone and put them to flight without shedding a single drop of blood. "Who are you really?" she whispered, turning her head to look directly into his eyes with a mixture of awe and admiration. John shrugged with that modesty she was beginning to recognize as genuine. "I'm just a man who learned a long time ago that the best fight is the one you win without unnecessarily hurting anyone." Yepa studied him in silence for a long moment, seeing layers of depth in this solitary man that she hadn't imagined before. There was more to John than met the eye, much more. "I owe you my life twice now," she said finally. Her voice was soft, but full of sincere emotion. "You owe me nothing at all. Any decent person would have done exactly the same." But as Thunder resumed the path eastward with a determined Yepa, knew that wasn't entirely true. Not just anyone would have risked their life that way for a stranger from another culture. Not just anyone would have shown such courage and at the same time such compassion. John was different, and that thought made her heart beat in a completely new way. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when they finally spotted the valley between the 2 twin mountains. Yepa felt her heart accelerate with anticipation as she recognized the familiar landscape of her home. Columns of smoke rose lazily from the tents of her village, drawing gray lines against the orange evening sky. "We're almost there," she murmured, unable to hide the emotion in her trembling voice. But before they could get any closer to the camp, the unmistakable sound of galloping hooves reached their ears from all directions. In a matter of seconds, they found themselves completely surrounded by a dozen Apache warriors mounted on war-painted horses. Their faces were severe as carved stone, and their drawn bows pointed directly at John with deadly precision. "Halt there, outsider," shouted the warrior leading the group, a young man with a fierce gaze and a scar on his left cheek. "Release the woman immediately, and get off the horse with your hands up." John began to raise his hands slowly, but Yepa acted before the situation could escalate dangerously. "Swift Bear, stop right now," she ordered, with an authoritative voice that surprised even John. "This man saved my life not once, but twice. I owe him everything. You will not lay a single finger on him while I breathe." The warrior named Swift Bear frowned with evident distrust, but lowered his bow slightly upon recognizing the unmistakable voice of the chief's daughter. The other warriors followed his example, although their expressions remained hostile and vigilant. "Miss Yepa, thanks to the spirits that you are alive," exclaimed Swift Bear, relief mixing with confusion on his young face. "Your father has had search parties, roaming the mountains for 3 full days. He was convinced the storm had claimed you forever. As you can clearly see, I am perfectly alive thanks to this brave man," replied Yepa with unshakable firmness. "Now escort us to the village. I want to see my father immediately." The warriors exchanged uncertain glances among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of bringing a stranger directly into the heart of their sacred camp. But no one dared to contradict a direct order from the chief's daughter, so they formed a tense escort around Thunder and began the final descent into the valley. The news of Yepa's return spread like fire in dry grass. By the time they arrived at the center of the village, it seemed the entire tribe had gathered to witness the historic moment. Men, women, elders, and children formed a human aisle, their eyes fixed on the strange couple advancing between the tents decorated with ancestral symbols. And then the crowd respectfully parted to let pass an imposing man walking with the dignity of one born to lead. He was tall and broad-backed despite his years, with black hair streaked with silver, falling over his shoulders like a mantle of wisdom. His face was a mask of absolute authority, but his dark eyes shone with barely contained emotion upon seeing his daughter. "Yepa." Chief Black Hawk's voice resonated with a mixture of relief and joy he tried unsuccessfully to disguise. "My girl, I thought I had lost you forever." Yepa dismounted quickly and ran into her father's arms, hugging him tightly while silent tears rolled down her bronzed cheeks. The chief held her against his chest for a long moment, closing his eyes as if he wanted to engrave that instant in his memory for all eternity. Yepa separated from the embrace and took out from her clothes a small leather pouch that she had protected with her own body during the entire terrible storm. "The medicinal herbs, father," she said with visible pride in her eyes. "When my horse fell, the only thing I thought about was protecting them. The elders need them desperately." Black Hawk took the pouch with trembling hands, looking at his daughter with renewed admiration. Even on the brink of death, she had thought first of her people rather than herself. "You are worthy, daughter of your mother," whispered the chief with a deeply emotional voice. Finally, Black Hawk raised his gaze toward John, who remained motionless on his horse, clearly aware that he was being evaluated by the most powerful man in these lands. "Who are you, stranger?" asked the chief. His voice was neutral, but his penetrating eyes studied every detail of John's face. "My name is John, great chief. I found your daughter nearly frozen in the middle of the storm and took her to a safe refuge. Nothing more than that." "That is not true, father," intervened Yepa, stepping forward to look her father directly in the eyes. "This man not only saved me from freezing to death. Today, the dust devils ambushed us in the northern canyon. There were 6 armed men, and John faced them alone to protect me. He put them to flight without shedding any blood." A murmur of amazement ran through the gathered crowd. The dust devils were known and feared throughout the territory for their ruthless cruelty. That a single man had defeated them was something bordering on living legend. Black Hawk studied John with renewed interest, and something akin to genuine respect began to form in his penetrating gaze. "You are welcome in our village, John. Tonight you will sleep in a tent of honor, as befits one who has protected my only daughter." Tomorrow we will speak more extensively." John bowed his head respectfully in a sign of gratitude. "I appreciate your hospitality, Great Chief." That night, the tribe celebrated Yepa's return with traditional songs and a large bonfire that illuminated the starry sky. John watched everything from a respectful distance, fascinated by the cultural richness and community warmth he was witnessing for the first time in his solitary life. More than once his eyes met Yepa's across the dancing flames. Each time she gifted him a small smile that made something warm blossom in John's chest, something he hadn't felt in many years of infinite solitude. The next morning, when the sun had barely begun to paint the sky in pink and gold tones, a young warrior approached John's tent with an important message. "The Chief Black Hawk requests your presence in his tent immediately, stranger." John nodded and followed the warrior through the camp that was just waking up. The chief's tent was the largest of all, decorated with eagle feathers and symbols telling the story of generations of brave and wise leaders. Black Hawk was seated in the center with his legs crossed on buffalo skins. In front of him, on a blanket woven with intricate ancestral designs, rested a leather bag that looked heavy and bulging. "Sit, John," indicated the chief with a solemn gesture of his hand. John obeyed, crossing his legs mirroring the great leader. Silence extended for a long moment charged with tension, only interrupted by the soft crackling of the small fire burning between them. "You have saved my daughter twice," began Black Hawk, his voice grave and measured. "First from the storm that would have ended her life, and then from those ruthless bandits who would have done terrible things to her. A debt like this cannot go unpaid. It goes against everything my people believe and represent." "Great Chief, I did nothing expecting any reward," responded John with evident sincerity. "Any decent man would have acted exactly the same in my place." Black Hawk smiled slightly, a gesture that softened his severe warrior's face for an instant. "And that answer confirms exactly what I suspected about your character, John." The chief pushed the leather bag forward. "This contains enough gold for you to live comfortably for the rest of your days without working. It is yours if you wish." John looked at the bag but made no move to touch it. Something in the chief's tone indicated that there was something more behind this apparently generous offer. "Oh?" asked John, sensing a second option was coming. Black Hawk's eyes sparkled with something like approval at the foreigner's insight. "Or," continued the chief slowly, "you can take my daughter Yepa's hand in sacred marriage. The gold or my daughter, John. The choice is completely yours." The silence that followed was so profound that John could hear the beating of his own heart rumbling in his ears. Chief Black Hawk's words floated in the dense air of the tent like leaves carried by the autumn wind. John could feel the weight of the decision pressing on his shoulders with the force of 1,000 mountains. The gold shone temptingly under the dim light filtering through the leather walls, promising a life of comfort and security he had never known in his years of solitary wandering. And then there was Yepa. Her face appeared in John's mind like a sunrise after the darkest storm. Those honey-colored eyes that had looked at him with distrust first, then with curiosity, and finally with something that dangerously resembled pure tenderness. Her soft laughter during conversations by the fire, her unshakable bravery in the face of danger, her spirit as free as the wind sweeping these infinite prairies. Any sane man would have accepted one of the two offers without thinking for a second. The gold represented absolute material freedom. Yepa represented a home, a family, a purpose after so many years of walking without a fixed destination through wild and lonely territories. But John was not just any man. Slowly, with deliberate and respectful movements, he stood up before the great chief. Black Hawk watched him with an inscrutable expression, his eyes dark as deep pools guarding ancestral secrets of past generations. "Great Chief Black Hawk," began John, his voice firm but loaded with genuine emotion, "I deeply appreciate your extraordinary generosity. Both the gold and your daughter's hand are gifts that any man would consider the greatest honor of his entire life." He paused, breathing deeply before continuing with the words that had taken shape in his heart during the night of silent reflection. However, I must respectfully reject both offers. A murmur of absolute surprise ran through the interior of the tent. Even the normally impassive face of Blackhawk showed a flash of genuine confusion at this completely unexpected response. "You reject the gold and you reject my daughter?" asked the chief, his voice tinged with incredulity. "Is my daughter not beautiful or worthy enough for a man like you?" "On the contrary, great chief," replied John with contained passion. "Your daughter, Yepa, is the most extraordinary woman I have met in all my years of life. Her beauty is undeniable, but it is her spirit that truly makes her incomparable. Her bravery, her compassion, her fierce loyalty to her people. Any man would be immensely fortunate to have her as a life partner." "Then I do not understand your rejection," said Blackhawk, genuinely bewildered for the first time in many years. John took a step forward, his eyes meeting the chief's with absolute and transparent honesty. "Great chief, I did not save your daughter expecting a reward of any kind. I did not do it for gold nor for the possibility of winning a wife. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Simply that. Because when I saw another human being in mortal danger, my only thought was to help without expecting anything in return." His voice strengthened as he continued speaking from the deepest part of his soul. "Gold cannot buy what truly has value in this world. And as for Yepa," John paused, choosing his next words with extreme care and reverence. "A woman like her cannot be given as a prize reward for any action, however heroic it may be. Yepa is a free spirit, a complete person with her own dreams, desires, and decisions. Her heart does not belong to you to give away. With all due respect, great chief, it belongs only to herself." The silence that followed was so dense it could be cut with a sharp knife. The elders present exchanged looks of absolute amazement. Never in the history of the tribe had anyone rejected an offer from the chief in such a way, much less a foreigner with no land or known name. Blackhawk remained motionless for what seemed like a complete eternity. Then, slowly, something extraordinary began to happen. The corners of his lips curved upward, and a genuine smile illuminated his severe face, like the sun illuminating the valley after a devastating storm. "Finally," said the chief, his voice resonating with deep satisfaction. "Finally, I find a true man in these difficult times." He stood up with the agility of someone much younger and placed both hands on John's shoulders in a gesture of supreme respect. "I have tested many suitors for my daughter over the years, John. Famous warriors, sons of powerful chiefs, rich men from distant lands. All, without exception, accepted the gold or Yepa's hand, without thinking twice. None understood the true test hidden behind my offer." The old chief's eyes shone with contained emotion as he continued revealing his wisdom. "I was looking for someone who saw my daughter for what she really is, not as a prize to be won, nor as a possession to be acquired, but as a free and valuable human being in her own right. You are the first to pass this test, John, the first to demonstrate that you truly deserve her love." Blackhawk turned toward the entrance of the tent and spoke a few words in his ancestral language. Moments later, Yepa entered with hesitant steps, her face revealing that she had heard every word of the conversation from outside. Her honey-colored eyes were wet with unshed tears as she looked at John with an expression he would never forget, even if he lived 1,000 years more. "The decision is now yours, my daughter," said Blackhawk with paternal tenderness. "This man has demonstrated his value and honor in the highest possible way, but your heart belongs only to you, exactly as he said. What do you decide to do with him?" Yepa advanced slowly toward John, each step resonating with the weight of a moment that would change 2 lives forever. She stopped in front of him, so close that he could see the small golden flecks in his sky-blue eyes. "Throughout my life," she began, her voice soft but clear as spring water, "I dreamed of finding someone who truly saw me. Not as the chief's daughter, not as a trophy to show off, not as a means to gain power or riches, but just as Yepa." She raised her hand and placed it gently on John's chest, right over his accelerated heart.